15 years ago, two of the leading sociologists of religion in America, they wrote a book together called Passing the Plate, with the subtitle, Why American Christians Don't Give More Money. The question animating this book was a simple one, and it arose from a strange paradox. Now, here's how they themselves describe that paradox. Most Christians belong to churches that teach tithing, the giving of 10% of one's income. Most American Christians also profess to want to see the gospel preached in the world, the hungry fed, the church strengthened, and the poor raised up to enjoy lives of dignity and hope, all tasks that normally require money. And yet, despite all of this, American Christians give away relatively little money to religious and other purposes. Most Christians belong to churches that teach tithing. That claim might surprise some Christians. After all, you can attend church for years without ever hearing someone preach or teach on the topic of biblical tithing. And yet, as these two authors demonstrate in a 30-page appendix at the end of the book, if you actually look at the official teachings of American denominations, from Baptist to Catholic to Pentecostal to Lutheran to Anglican to Presbyterian, and so on and so forth, if you actually look at their official teachings, almost all of them say that Christians have a duty to be generous in their giving, and that at a minimum, that means 10% of your income. And nevertheless, what these two sociologists found when they looked at the data of actual giving is that the average American Christian churchgoer gives less, far less than that standard. Which isn't to say they give less than non-Christians. Religious people still give a higher percentage of their income than non-religious people, but not by much. American Christians, on average, give away approximately 2 to 3% of their income. And only 9.4% of Christians, only 9 out of every 100 Christians, gives that biblical tithe, the 10% or more. Now, that's discouraging, to be sure, but you might wonder, why am I beginning a lesson on Deuteronomy by talking about the failure of Christians to tithe? Well, it's simple, really. It's because that's exactly how Moses concludes his very long discussion of God's commandments to his people. That discussion that began all the way back in chapter 12. In chapter 26, Moses, he wraps it all up with some instructions on tithing. And in many ways, that's actually very fitting. Because as you might remember, before Moses began talking about all these laws, before he began telling people how to avoid idolatry and what restrictions to place on their kings, how to conduct themselves during war, before he began giving them laws about how to speak and when to assemble and how to treat one another, before all of that, he reminded them that their relationship with God wasn't something that they had earned or deserved. Their relationship with God as his people was founded purely on grace. It was a gift. And now, as Moses concludes his talk about what God requires of them, he comes back to that same theme. Remember, he's telling them, don't forget, everything you have is a gift. And your way of acknowledging that, your way of remembering that all is a gift is to give. Now let's explore these two themes in turn. First, all is gift. Notice how this chapter begins. Notice what Moses says. When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Moses is intentional with his words here. He doesn't just say, when you come into the land, but when you come into the land that the Lord is giving you. And then he repeats that phrase in the next verse. You shall take some of the first of all the fruit of the ground, which you harvest from your land that the Lord your God is giving you. 3 times in a matter of 3 verses, Moses reminds the Israelites that everything they're about to enjoy in their new homeland, the land, their homes, the harvest itself, they have to remember that they have received all of it at the hand of God. They didn't acquire the land, it was a gift. What's more, Moses says that when they come to the priest with the first fruits of their harvest, they will be asked to make a public declaration, which begins this way: "My father was a wandering Aramean." It's not entirely clear who this refers to. It could be Abraham or it could be Jacob. Either way, it's a rather odd way of talking about the great patriarchs of Israel. Why say he is an Aramean? And why describe him as wandering? Well, by calling him an Aramean, that individual Israelite is remembering that his forefathers, they weren't some holy or special people. They weren't more impressive or more righteous than everyone else, as Moses said earlier in Deuteronomy. They were just normal Mesopotamian pagans. What's more, they weren't extraordinarily strong or prosperous. They were homeless and they were in peril. That's what Moses means by wandering. It's a way of talking about those times when Abraham and Jacob were in trouble, when a famine had robbed them of their food and they were forced to go down to Egypt for help. In other words, by saying, "My father was a wandering Aramean," what you're actually saying is, I am from a family of people who were nothing and who had nothing until the Lord showed up. Then this declaration continues, and the worshiper remembers how his people were enslaved and abused in Egypt, and how God came down and liberated them from oppression and brought them out of Egypt. And he says, he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Every year, the Israelites must come to the priest and recite these words. Every year, they must remember and publicly confess that everything they have, everything they enjoy is simply a gift of God. And then, as a way of acknowledging that gift, they must give something in return. Verse 2 explains what they are bringing on this occasion. It's a portion of the first fruits of the harvest, the first yield of their produce. And when they bring it, they're to recite that declaration about how God has shown grace to them, and then they are to say, "And behold, now I bring the first fruit of the ground which you, O Lord, have given me. And you shall set it down before the Lord your God and worship before the Lord your God." Why do this? Why offer this gift of first fruits of produce to the Lord? It's not as if God needs it. That was the logic behind a lot of ancient Mesopotamian religion. They believed that the gods depended on human sacrifices of animals and food in order to eat. But the Bible makes it clear that the God of Israel isn't like that. As he himself says in Psalm 50, "If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine." The God of Israel has no need of their produce, but they must bring it anyway, because it is a way of acknowledging where it comes from. It is a way of recognizing that their harvest is a gift of God. And that's a principle that runs throughout biblical worship. As one scholar who's written extensively about Israel's worship life says, one simply did not think of going before the Lord empty-handed. The spirit of true worship is gratitude, and generosity is the evidence of gratitude. What's remarkable about this offering of first fruits is that it's actually not even a part of the normal tithe that Israelites were required to give. And yet that tithe is exactly what Moses talks about in the next couple verses. In verses 12 through 15, he instructs them what to do with their annual tithe, and especially what to do every third year of tithing. If you're wondering what this refers to, all you have to do is look back to Deuteronomy chapter 14, where the laws about tithing are first given. In chapter 14, Moses had said, "You shall tithe all the yield of your seed that comes from the field year by year, the tithe of your grain, of your wine, and of your oil, and the firstborn of your herd and flock." The word tithe refers to a specific portion of a person's wealth or income, 10% to be exact. That's what the word tithe means. And that's the minimum standard that God's people were expected to give to him as an act of worship. Before free will offerings, before Thanksgiving offerings, before the first fruits of your produce, every Israelite was required to give 10% of all they had earned or received that year over to the Lord as an act of worship. And they were supposed to travel all the way to Jerusalem to do it. And if they couldn't make the trip for some reason, then, as Moses says in Deuteronomy 14, then they were still required to calculate 10% of their annual income, as well as whatever expenses they would have spent on a trip to Jerusalem. And they were supposed to send all of that to the temple in Jerusalem on their behalf. That's what Moses has in mind when he talks about tithing here in Deuteronomy 26. And what he's saying to them is not only a reminder that they must pay this tithe, but a reminder that this is something which they owe to God. This is something that they have been commanded to do. When they come before the Lord, they must be able to say, I have removed the sacred portion out of my house. And moreover, I have given it to the Levite, the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all your commandment that you have commanded me. Because in saying that, they are acknowledging, again, that everything they own is a gift. It doesn't really belong to them anyway. And to acknowledge that, they are returning a tenth of it to the one to whom it does belong. Interestingly, although he doesn't use the word tithe, that's the same logic that the Apostle Paul appeals to in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 when he is encouraging some Christians in Corinth to give generously and sacrificially to a collection he's taking up for some impoverished Christians in Jerusalem. For you know, Paul says to them, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, by his poverty, might become rich. In other words, remember that everything you have is a result of the generosity and kindness of Jesus who made himself poor for you. Or as he puts it even more succinctly in his first letter to the Corinthians, what do you have that you did not receive? Everything you have is a gift, so give. Give a tenth of it back to God as a grateful acknowledgement that you've received it at his hand. And imitate his generosity to you by giving generously to those in need. I don't think it's a coincidence that Moses ends his discussion of God's commandments with these instructions about tithing. Nor do I think it should surprise us. After all, as Jesus himself said, money and possessions are one of the most common rivals to God. Many people choose to serve mammon rather than God. And Moses knew that as the Israelites moved into a land of prosperity, it would be very tempting for them to begin putting their trust in money and possessions rather than God. And they could easily forget that fundamental truth that was at the heart of their relationship with God, that everything they have is a gift. That's something that we also need to remember. Because just like those ancient Israelites, we too live in a time of great prosperity. And I'm not just talking about Americans. Wealth and income have dramatically increased around the world in the last 50 years. Between the years 1970 and 2008, economists estimate that the number of people living in poverty decreased by 64%. And you'd think that would make us more generous, wouldn't you? Because of everything we have. But that's not necessarily true. In fact, in that book I mentioned in the beginning of this lesson, those two sociologists discovered that despite a massive growth of real per capita income over the 20th century, the average percentage share of income given by American Christians not only did not grow in proportion, but actually declined during this time period. In other words, a lack of generosity doesn't seem to be driven by a lack of wealth or resources. To the contrary, the more we receive, the less we seem to be giving. And that's why the practice of tithing is so important, not just for ancient Israelites, but but for modern Christians as well. And why it's important to include tithes and offerings as an act of worship. To tithe isn't to make a charitable contribution. God didn't need Israel's charity. It's not why he told them to tithe. No, the purpose of tithing is to acknowledge that everything we have comes to us as a gift. There is nothing we have that we have not received. And in response, with gratitude, as an act of public thanks, we give back a portion to God. Moses told the Israelites that when they came with their offerings, they were supposed to begin with that liturgical declaration, "My father was a wandering Aramean." In our church, we actually do something quite similar. Every Sunday, as we prepare ourselves to receive communion and prepare to come forward with our tithes and offerings, we all join together in a public declaration and say, "Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the victory and the glory and the majesty. For everything in heaven and on earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all. All things come from you, O Lord, and of your own have we given you." All things come from you, O Lord, and of your own have we given you. We acknowledge, in other words, that all is gift, and so in response, we give.